Music from a number of different styles by important composers that represent the history of jazz, at least in the past 75 years. So the first piece we're going to play is a very important composition written by the great Miles Davis on his most famous and best-selling album. It's called Kind of Blue. How many of you have a copy of Kind of Blue? Oh. It's the biggest selling jazz recording ever. Came out in 1959, and people still, are purchasing. Actually, nobody buys albums anymore. I had to get an album to show to the kids what it was. I said, back in the olden days, we used to put this on a platter, and we'd sit in a room, we'd all kind of, do whatever we did and listen to the music and talk about it. Kids don't do that anymore. They just put their earbuds in, and then you're trying to talk to them, and they're not responding to you, and then you realize that they have earbuds in there. How many have experienced that? Everybody has. My wife does it to me. I'm talking to her, she's like, you didn't hear a word I said, she's got the buds in. But we're going to do this piece, it's called All Blues, and it's going to feature 4 members of our group, and I hope you enjoy this. It's a wonderful arrangement, and it's a historic composition. I felt it was important that the kids are exposed to some music by the great Miles Davis. I thought it very important to introduce the children to 70s funk. One of my favorite bands from the early 70s, mid-70s, was a group called War. Napoli titled name of a band from that period in American politics, during the height of the Vietnam War and all the unrest that was going on in the country. But this was a wonderful group. They had a very unique sound. And they had some huge hits. And the sound was really mostly from, they used a flute player and a harmonica together in unison. They created a sound. You just hear one note from this band, you know it's War. And what was their biggest hit? Oh, come on.
Cisco Kid.
Well, that's one of them. Thank you, Miss Mary. But the one that really does it is, what's it called? Low Rider. So I thought it'd be very important to introduce them to that sound. You guys ready? Didn't know it. Okay, so make sure you look at this opening section. So we'll go right and raise the shot. And then I'm going to cue measure 51 and read the rest of the chart. Gotta get on the move. You ready for that a little bit? 1, 2,
You hear the voice? In your imaginations.
Did you hear the voice? Yeah, I could hear that. Oh my God, does that bring back memories? Am I that old? Did somebody say yes? Who said that? Thank you very much. Lowrider. Now, so that's important. Now, the Count Basie Orchestra was, in terms of its ability to swing, I think it was the greatest big band of all time. You know, Duke Ellington had a great band, but Duke showed us the possibilities of what you could do with jazz. It was an amazing band. He used the members of his band as if he was painting a portrait, but for pure swinging, it's got to be Count Basie. Oh my Lord. So I thought it'd be really important for us to play something made famous by the Count Basie Orchestra. This is called Corner Pocket, but was originally called Until I Met You, and it was made famous in the mid-1950s. Basie had a great band out of Kansas City up until about 1949. That was the original band. Then he disbanded the group when economics things were changing. And then he formed the group again in 1953, and that's called the New Testament Band. For me, that was my favorite era of Count Basie. And so we're going to play Corner Pocket. But hopefully, if anybody knows about Count Basie, you might recognize this. It's a wonderful arrangement. And how old are you? I'm talking to you. 12. It's 12 going on 52. He plays with a high school jazz band. We did a concert at the Gen Conference, didn't we? We played together, didn't we? It was you who was sitting there. I had to give him a telephone book so we could reach the keys. What a talent from Sandtown. You ready, Sean? You sure? They're available for parties. You have to go to the musician's room and tell them they're all like 12 years old. That was fabulous. And that's not an easy piece of music to play, especially when you think about the bassy style and the swing eighth notes. It's just something that really has taken us a couple of months to really perfect that swing, that easy lilt that is just so elusive to most people who don't understand how jazz works. I want to do something in the Afro-Caribbean style, and this is written by actually a friend of mine, and he calls it chalupa. But Afro-Caribbean music is more closely aligned with true West African music, because if you go to Puerto Rico, you go to the Dominican Republic, you go to Cuba, and any other islands, the music is much more closely aligned to pure West African rhythms, and it's really, as Jelly Roll Morton said, you can't have jazz, and he said in his own words, without the Latin tinge. So it's at the root system of American jazz. And how many have been down to the Caribbean islands, been to Puerto Rico, or to Dominican Republic or Haiti? Anybody been traveling? Raise your hand, it's okay. But when you go there and you hear the authentic music, it's almost pure West African in nature. So this one borrows really heavily from that, but it's a little bit Americanized. And it's one of my favorite types of music. I lived for many years in the city of Miami, and I had a chance to play with some amazing bands early in my career, and there was a great respect and great love for this music. So we're going to play a piece called Chalupa.
You guys ready? Charlie Parker was one of the great.
Just absorbed all the sounds on 18th and Vine. In the 1930s, Kansas City was one of the most corrupt cities on the planet. It was so corrupt that the Depression never even affected the city. There was so much illegal this and that going on. But in addition to that, they had some of the greatest musicians coming out of Kansas City in the 1930s, especially saxophone players. So I think it would be appropriate for us to really pay homage to one of the greatest of jazz saxophonists ever. His name was Charles Christian Parker, also known as Bird or Yardbird. And one of his most famous compositions was a very, very simple blues that he wrote, and he called it Now's the Time. I want to thank you for your support. I want to thank these wonderful young musicians here. We're going to leave with Charlie Parker's Now's the Time. I want you to make sure you have a wonderful rest of the weekend. Do something meaningful, and think about all the great music you just heard. I want to thank the Davis Family Foundation. I want to thank the people here who run the Rialto Center for the Arts for supporting this great program, and that we can help to perpetuate jazz to these young musicians who really are going to be the future of jazz. Okay, you guys ready?
Not you. Jackson is for solo. Now remember, you got to get a chorus piece. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3.
Thank you so much. Thank you. We really appreciate your support, your love, and your commitment to the kids, to the music, and to the betterment of society through the arts. That's all I have to say. Thank you so much, and we will see you soon. Great job, guys. Wonderful. And over here, we got one of my student assistants. This is Riley. That's Matt.